morning. Welcome to Bible Study today. We are talking through this period in between the Old Testament and New Testament. So far we talked about the Greeks, Alexander the Great, and then there were 4 kingdoms after him. The ones closest to where the Jews were living were the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. Then we talked about how there was a Seleucid king who tried to force Hellenization, especially... That's because it's not on. Thank you. The Seleucid king tried to force Hellenization and Greek worship on the people in Jerusalem, which prompted a rebellion, and the Maccabees fought back, and then the Hasmonean dynasty was able to rule the Jews for about 100 years. Last time we talked about how there's a group of books that was written during this time period. It's called the Apocrypha. It's not part of the Scriptures. There's some things about it that is just not on the same level as the books in the Bible. But Christians have said these are some useful things to read, and so if you want to read through the Apocrypha, there are some history books, books of wisdom, some books that seem to be very much just tall tales. I don't know that even the people when it was written would say this was something that factually happened. But that was last time. So today, the plan is to talk about how the Roman Empire is now going to come on the scene and be dominant by the time of Jesus. And then next time, local politics with Herod the Great, and probably too like the Pharisees and Sadducees, and how local politics developed around Jerusalem in that last couple hundred years leading up to the birth of Jesus. So let's begin with a prayer today and then talk about the Roman Empire. Lord God, your mercy is new every morning. I thank you for your grace to each of us today and to us as your church. And I pray that we'd continue to grow in you. Use this hour to bless us in our understanding of the events surrounding our Savior Jesus. We pray all that in Jesus' name. Amen. Before we keep going, any questions you've got or comments on the last couple weeks? Then same caveat as the last couple weeks. This is an area where I know some stuff, but I'm not the expert. And this is me trying to pull together enough to what can we talk about in 1 hour about the Roman Empire. And that kind of is going to depend on like how much do you know of this time period, or has it been since like high school history class that you thought through ancient world history? But I think this is fascinating, and even in the news today, there have been people looking back at what happened with the Roman government and trying to say, how does that impact, because our government in America was based largely on the Roman Republic. And we'll talk today about how the Roman Republic turned into a dictatorship. And even today, people are wondering, when is it that we have people in our government trying to take on too much power, and how do you keep the system going as it is? The Roman government went through 3 main phases, and once they changed, it never really went back to the earlier, what the phase was like. There's history before this and after this. But the dates I usually see with the Roman Empire, the Romans themselves said that Rome was founded in 753 BC. Now that date comes from the birth of Jesus looking backwards, so they wouldn't have used that number. For them, that was year 1. So as they're counting history, the Romans would number the years from the date that Rome was founded. The old myth was that there were 2 twins, Romulus and Remus. There's a long poem called the Aeneid that talks about how Rome's ancestors actually came out of the aftermath of the fall of Troy. You know the story of like Helena, Troy, and the Greek battles and the Trojan horse and all that stuff. How much of that is really rooted in history and how much of it is making up a myth to talk about where they came from? The Roman legends were that there were some survivors from the city of Troy that ended up settling in the area around Rome. And there were these twin boys born who were abandoned and then nursed by a wolf. And one of those boys, Romulus, founded the city of Rome and then was the first king of Rome. So if you look at those 3 phases, how many years is that? 200 or 250 years where Rome was ruled by kings. Then there was a major civil war and rebellion, and the kings got overthrown, and it shifted to being a republic. And in the Roman Republic, you'd have men who were chosen for offices that were limited in time. One of those main offices was called being the consul, and I think the consuls was like 1 year. 2 years. So the idea, kind of like our country was, is that we don't want to have any one person be the king and rule for a really long time. There was a story, and as far as I know, this is based in reality, that one of those consuls, his name was Cincinnatus. Americans named the city of Cincinnati after him. That there's a crisis that develops. He gets asked to take over leadership during the crisis. He leaves his farm. He fights, manages the crisis, and then he says, I'm going to go back to my farm, and he gave away power and went back home. That kind of being the ideal, that you don't have a leader who their whole goal is to have as much power as possible, that power was supposed to be used to serve for a time being, and then you would pass it on to somebody else. So Roman Republic lasted almost 500 years. If you look at when it ended, that date is really close to the birth of Jesus. And so there were some huge changes in the Roman Empire leading up to the time when Jesus was born. During that time that it was the Republic, Rome wasn't the main power in the Mediterranean. So here's a map from Wikipedia of the Carthaginians. I don't know is this an area that, like, there's a large kind of empire on the northern side of Africa with a headquarters at Carthage. They were connected to the Phoenicians. So in the Bible, the people who worship Baal, they were connected with a larger trading empire that spanned much of the Mediterranean. So the coast of what is Spain today and northern Africa. So Rome is where Italy is now today. If you'd think through the world powers we've been talking about, to Rome's east is Greece. So Alexander the Great, and the Greeks are really strong over there, but Alexander takes his army to the east. So a lot of the Greek effort was aimed at defeating the Persians. There were some battles where the Romans held out against the Greeks. If you've heard of someone talking about a Pyrrhic victory, there was a Greek general named Pyrrhus who took an army into Italy. And that word Pyrrhic victory means that you win the victory, but you end up damaging yourself so badly that you end up losing, even as you win. That Pyrrhus was able to defeat the Romans a couple of times, but he ended up getting so weakened that he was never able to win the war, and in the end the Romans were able to survive that. If you go south of there down into Egypt, this is where you've got the Ptolemies. So this is all developing the same time as we've been talking about the Seleucids and Ptolemies out to the east. The Romans are gradually getting stronger and stronger in Italy, and you've got the Carthaginians are in the western Mediterranean and northern coast of Africa. So in the 200s BC, that's when there was a Carthaginian general named Hannibal, who took his army from Spain and then over the Alps with elephants into Italy. And kind of like with Pyrrhus, the Romans ended up losing quite a bit to begin with, but were able to hold out just enough that Hannibal never took Rome. And eventually the Romans were able to reverse that battle and take it to Carthage, and the Romans ended up winning those wars, so that by the end of the 200s, the Carthaginian Empire was really defeated, and the Romans now had control over most of the western Mediterranean. Same time, those Greek countries those empires are starting to decline. So the Romans start taking over cities in Greece. So like the city of Corinth was destroyed by the Romans. A lot of the cities where Paul went, 100 years or 200 years before Paul, the Romans had come through and conquered most of Greece. So this would be that time period of the Roman Republic. Rome is getting stronger and stronger over in the west. Can't promise I can answer any deep questions, but anything you're thinking of that you want to ask about so far with that? The Romans now are more and more going to start being part of the Jews' lives over in Palestine. So do you remember when we looked at the book of Daniel and the Seleucids and Ptolemies? Daniel had predicted that ships from the west, from Kittim, would turn back the Greek general. And that's one reason the Seleucids had to leave Egypt, is that the Ptolemies formed an alliance with the Romans, and based on that threat, the Seleucids had to leave Egypt. So that's in the 100s BC. Last time we looked at some things in the book of Maccabees. Here's 1 Maccabees chapter 8, talking about that Maccabean rebellion and Judas Maccabees. So in consideration of these things, Judas chose Oepolemus, the son of John, the son of Achus, and Jason, son of Eleazar, and sent them to Rome to make a league of amity and confederacy with them, and to entreat them that they would take the yoke from them, for they saw that the kingdom of the Grecians did oppress Israel with servitude. They went therefore to Rome, which was a very great journey, and came into the Senate, where they spake and said, Judas Maccabeus with his brethren and the people of the Jews have sent us unto you to make a confederacy and peace with you, and that we might be registered with your confederates and friends. So that matter pleased the Romans well. And this is the copy of the epistle which the Senate wrote back again in tables of brass and sent to Jerusalem, that there might have by them a memorial of peace and confederacy. Good success be to the Romans and to the people of the Jews by sea and by land forever. The sword also an enemy be far from them. If there come first any war upon the Romans, or any of their confederates throughout all their dominion, the people of the Jews shall help them, as the time shall be appointed with all their heart. Neither shall they give anything unto them that make war upon them, or aid unto them victuals, weapons, money, or ships, as it hath seemed good unto the Romans, but that they keep their covenants without taking anything therefore. In the same manner also, if war should come upon the nation of the Jews, the Romans shall help them with all their heart, according to the time being appointed to them. Neither shall victuals be given to them that take part against them, or weapons, or money, or ships, as it hath seemed good to the Romans, but they shall keep their covenants, and that without deceit. How much more do you want to read of this? Is that enough? So what's the main thought of this section? The Jews are fighting against the Seleucids, and who are they looking at as an ally? The Romans. And at this point, are the Romans interested in ruling over Judea? No. What are the Romans interested in? Romans are interested in expanding their area of influence and forming alliances with other nations. So the promise here is that if the Romans get attacked, the Jews are going to send an army to aid the Romans. And if the Jews get attacked, the Romans are going to aid them. And also, the Romans aren't going to provide food or supplies to Israel's enemies, and the Jews aren't going to provide food or weapons to Rome's enemies. So again, I don't know every detail from this time period. I don't know that the Romans ever sent any troops to help out the Jews fight the Greeks. But just as an example of this is like the 160s BC, Rome is not some nation beyond the known world anymore. The Jews are actually sending people on a ship to Rome to talk to the Roman Senate. And the comment is, that's a really long trip. You think of how far would someone travel from Jerusalem to make an alliance? Yeah, they're willing to travel all the way to Rome to talk to the Roman Senate.
Why? Why was that so long?
Going back to the time of the Maccabees, they're the little guys fighting against the big Seleucid Empire.
That was my follow-up question, the size difference between the two groups.
The Romans would have been a lot stronger, but again, if you have a lot of small allies, that's part of what Rome is trying to do as well. So now we're getting toward the end of the Roman Republic. So the Maccabees is about the 160s BC. Maccabees are able eventually to win independence from the Seleucids. So starting about the year 140 is the Hasmonean kingdom. So then the Jews are ruling themselves for about the next 100 years, from about 160 or 140 till about 60 BC. And that doesn't mean everything was great. A lot of those Hasmonean rulers, you read their histories, and they're pretty corrupt. And that, remember the word Hellenization, taking on everything Greek? Some of the Hasmonean kings live very Greek-style lifestyles, even though they are Jewish rulers. So over that 100 years, there's a lot of political intrigue among the Hasmoneans. And that brings us to about the 60s BC, where there was a question about who was going to rule next, and there were two brothers in this Hasmonean family. One of them was the one who seemed the most likely to be the next ruler, but he had a brother who had a friend in the Idumeans, which comes from the name Edom. So do you know from Old Testament maps how the nation of Edom was Esau's descendants living off south and east of Israel? If you've seen pictures of Petra, there are these carvings and cliffs. Petra is in the area that's like Idumea. So that's another kingdom that's just east and south of Jerusalem. There's an Idumean named Antipater who tells the other brother that he should fight for the throne of the Hasmoneans. And based on that, there's a civil war that starts between these two brothers in the 60s, where they're actually fighting against each other in Jerusalem. One brother lays siege to the other one at Jerusalem. And both of them, again, Rome has been looked on as an ally. Both of the brothers appeal for the Romans to come and help. Now, part of that backdrop is that the Romans don't know it yet. They assume the Republic's been going for 500 years. The Romans always said they would never have a king. But leading up to this time period, there have been consuls and generals in the Roman armies who have been amassing more and more power. And about this time, so about the year 60, people don't know exactly when this alliance formed, but there were three powerful Romans who made a secret alliance that they were going to help each other. And looking back now, tri means three, vir means man and strength, so there's this three-man power team, Pompey, Crassus, and Julius Caesar. Of those three, do you know, are those names familiar? I think Julius Caesar is the one who's the most famous. He actually is the weakest of the three as they begin this alliance. Pompey is the one who has been a hugely successful general, celebrated triumphs in Rome. Pompey's campaigns were mostly toward the east side of the Roman Empire. I guess it wasn't empire yet, Roman Republic. Julius Caesar was fighting more in the west. So anybody who took Latin in high school probably read Julius Caesar's accounts of his wars in what's France today, Gaul. So Julius Caesar is leading armies on the west side of the Republic. Pompey is out in the east. Crassus, from what I know, he was more of a power player and was incredibly rich. So the three of them made an alliance that they were going to be helping each other and working together. Now, Pompey happens to be the general who's over in Syria, north of Jerusalem, when these two brothers are having the civil war. Both of them appeal to the Romans and say, be my ally and side with me so that I'm the one who gets to rule next. Josephus, we've read some of his stuff. He has a long section detailing everything that's going on. Each brother said they would pay the Romans money if they would take their side in this dispute. So the way it ended up is that the Romans at first sided with one of the brothers, but then Pompey had a lot of success with the campaign he was doing, and all of a sudden his troops are freed. And so Pompey decides, I don't need to support either brother. He just goes and lays siege to Jerusalem himself, and Pompey in 63 BC conquers Jerusalem. So it's not as though he was just invited in by the Hasmoneans, But their internal conflict and their asking the Romans to come and settle the dispute was the catalyst for having Pompey come then and take over Jerusalem. I skimmed through some of this, and Josephus, I don't always have the patience to hear everything he writes because it's a lot of words. Here's a section from Josephus, Antiquities, Book 14, about Pompey coming to Jerusalem. Of the Jews, starting at paragraph 71, of the Jews there fell 12,000, but of the Romans very few. Absalom, who was at once both uncle and father-in-law to Aristobulus, was taken captive, and no small enormities were committed about the temple itself, which in former ages had been inaccessible and seen by none. For Pompey went into it, and not a few of those that were with him also, and saw all that which was unlawful for any other men to see, but only for the high priests. There were in that temple the golden table, the golden candlestick, and the pouring vessels, and a great quantity of spices. And besides these, there were among the treasures 2,000 talents of sacred money. Yet did Pompey touch nothing of all this, on account of his regard for religion, and in this point also he acted in a manner that was worthy of his virtue. The next day he gave order to those that had charge of the temple to cleanse it, and to bring what offerings the law required to God, and restored the high priesthood to Hyrcanus, both because he had been useful to him in other respects, and because he hindered the Jews in the country from giving Aristobulus any assistance in his war against him. Did you follow some of that? What did Pompey do when he conquered Jerusalem?
He went into the temple.
He went into the temple personally. And you think of things, that would have been hugely irreverent for the Jews. He did consecrate it again the next day. As far as interesting facts of things between the Old Testament and New Testament, I think I've got that picture in PowerPoint too. This is an artist later on, so I don't know that this is at all accurate of what it would have looked like. But the Roman general Pompey and a bunch of his soldiers actually went into the temple in 63 BC. What did they see inside?
The Holy of Holies.
They went into the Holy of Holies, but from that list of stuff that Josephus says they saw, what was in the Holy of Holies?
Candlesticks.
That would have been in the area that was outside the Holy of Holies.
Unspeakables.
They saw things that no one other than the high priest was ever supposed to see. Was the Ark of the Covenant on the list? No. So this is one where some people claim that they know where the Ark of the Covenant is, but I think it's probably likely that the Ark of the Covenant did not exist at the time of Jesus, because when Pompey went there, that was not something that he saw as being inside the temple. So did the Babylonians take it away and destroy it when they destroyed the first temple? So Pompey walked into the Holy of Holies, and there's no Ark of the Covenant, and what surprised him was that there were no images. There was no idol of some deity there. It was like he walked into an empty room, which fits with the Jewish Old Testament believers' faith, which is shared by us too, that there is only one God and he does not have an image that we worship. So that Pompey went into the temple. He saw some things in the room heading in, but the Ark of the Covenant wasn't there. And then it wasn't like he was trying to take over the religion that was happening there. So then he allowed them to purify the temple the next day and resume Jewish worship at the temple. Also in that last paragraph, those were the names of the two men who were fighting against each other, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. Pompey sided with Hyrcanus, which is the one that Idumean king Antipater had been supporting. So this is where next time we're talking about Herod the Great, But this is where Herod's family gets an into Jewish politics, because Antipater the Idumean is the father of Herod the Great, and he had a sense for knowing how to play his cards exactly right. So in the civil war, he's the one who supports the less powerful brother. He ends up being on the winning side when Pompey takes over, so that who ends up winning in the end, it's not either side of the Hasmonean dynasty, it's Herod the Great's family. Because now as Pompey leaves, he lets Hyrcanus be the one who's in control, but as the weaker brother, the one who really is the power behind the throne now is Antipater the Idumean, father of Herod the Great. So if you're going to say, when did the Jewish period of independence end? You started probably not right at Hanukkah and the dedication of the temple, but about 140 BC is when the Hasmoneans started ruling, and they ruled for about the next 80 years until 63 BC when Pompey conquered Jerusalem. Now, that next period, it's not that Judea was part of the Roman Empire. They're like a client state where there's a local ruler who answers to Rome without it being considered part of the Roman Empire. So, here's the map my Bible software has for the Roman Empire, and it's color coordinated by when areas were added to the empire. So the purple is Roman territory by the time of the death of Julius Caesar in 44. So this would be 20 years after Pompey went inside the temple. If you're looking at that, is Jerusalem and Judea on this map part of the Roman Empire? Not officially. It depends on how you're counting it. The Romans are going to have a huge amount of influence there. They're the ones who are setting up the client ruler, who's going to be Herod. But if you look at the Roman Empire with the purple areas, Italy, of course, is the area around Rome. Greece is ruled by the Romans, most of Turkey. The northern coast of Africa would have been the old Carthaginian Empire and the coast of Spain. Julius Caesar conquered much of Gaul, which is modern-day France. Pausing again there, anything you want to ask about or other things you know from this time period that's like, oh, here's where that fits.
Can I just clarify something? For some reason, I'm not getting this in my head. Pompey was over what territory before he took over Jerusalem?
He's the Roman general fighting off on the eastern side of the Roman Republic.
Okay, so he decides on his own he's going to take over Jerusalem, even though they have this pact, right? Where they were going to work for each other, basically?
I mean, that pact was from the time of the Maccabees.
Okay.
And alliances shifted so much. And if you read this time from Roman history, the Romans were gobbling up as much territory anywhere as they could.
Okay.
And so nobody in Rome is going to say, Pompey, why are you intervening in Jerusalem or taking over? He's winning triumphs, these huge military parades in Rome for the stuff that he's doing out east. Also on this map, you see the area in yellow, area temporarily controlled by Rome. Much of what had been the Persian Empire, the Seleucid Empire, never was controlled by the Romans. So there are other nations that are fighting the Romans on the Eastern Front, especially the Parthians. So again, we're overlapping with next week, but the Parthians actually conquered Jerusalem in like 40 BC. So just as Herod the Great is beginning his reign, not only did the Romans conquer Jerusalem, the Parthians came in from the east and conquered Jerusalem. So for the Jews, it was really hard to figure out who should you be forming an alliance with, because they're always on the edge of a whole bunch of different empires. So at this time, you've got the Romans to the west, you've got the Parthians to the east. I think there was another king, like in the area of Turkey. If you look at that green area, that whole green area was not under Roman control at the time of Julius Caesar, which is why Pompey is over in Syria fighting. So Syria would be that purple area that is under Roman control. So the Romans are simultaneously fighting wars at like 3, 4, 5 different places at once. And you've got different Roman generals who have different legions under their control. Pompey is the one who was around Israel and Judea. This alliance, though, was only as long as it served the best interest of those 3 men. And eventually it fell apart when they became more powerful. There was nobody else they were fighting against, and so they ended up fighting against each other. Because, again, the Roman Empire, Republic changed into an empire because there were different men who wanted to take over full control of everything and not to just have it be for a year or 2. And Pompey and Julius Caesar probably both were like that. So of these 3, and again, I would have to go back and, how did Crassus die? I think he was older. But the way the triumvirate goes is you end up having Pompey fighting against Julius Caesar. Who ends up winning between the 2 of them? Julius Caesar ends up coming out stronger than Pompey. So with Herod's family, again, Antipater, he knew how to play his cards right. He initially was an ally of Pompey. Then when Caesar defeated Pompey, he's like, oh, I've got to switch sides. So then Julius Caesar finds himself under attack in Egypt, and Antipater sends the Jewish army to bail out Julius Caesar. And because of that, Julius Caesar actually made Antipater a Roman citizen and conferred all these honors on him. So the people around Judea now are having to navigate these alliances. Pompey had been the stronger force, but then when Pompey is defeated by Caesar, now they've got to say, oh, we always loved Caesar. He was our favorite. Caesar takes his army across the Rubicon and marches into Rome, which was illegal. And so Julius Caesar, I think, today now has kind of, depending on what you think of this period of history, either he's your hero as this really strong man, or he's a horrible person who ended the Roman Republic. Because he's the one now who, at the end of the first triumvirate, starts amassing all the powers for himself that were supposed to be divided. So the Roman Senate, again, I don't, all the facts, he ended up taking on himself the responsibility of deciding who got Senate seats. And then he increased the number, how many hundred there were, but he increased the number of seats to 900, and then he stacked the Senate with loyal supporters. So that now there is no opposition to him from the Senate. And in different ways, like the terms of office that had been in the Roman Constitution, he starts rewriting that so that he is on the path to be able to have just power as long as he lives, and there's nobody who's going to be a check on him. It's at that point when members of the Roman Senate conspire to assassinate him. So that's where, going back to that other map, the year 44 is kind of a breaking point, because that's when Julius Caesar gets assassinated. So if you read Shakespeare stuff in high school, the whole Et tu, Brute stuff, and you've got a man named Brutus, who is part of the assassination of Julius Caesar. But now this throws the whole empire into confusion, because what's next? Julius Caesar had changed a lot of how the system was working. Is it going to go back to being a republic, or is there going to be somebody else who's now going to step in on the road to being like a total dictator? So then you get the second triumvirate. The three men coming out of this are Mark Antony, Lepidus, and Octavian. The men who had assassinated Julius Caesar, they fled right away because they didn't have enough support to be able to maintain power. They were able to get rid of Julius Caesar, but they had to leave. So now there's a civil war between people who sided with Caesar and people who sided with the assassins and said, we need to try to restore the Republic. Julius Caesar was an enemy of the state. So now there's a civil war between these three. The second triumvirate were people who defended Julius Caesar and said we need to destroy the assassins. So then there's a battle where, like, Brutus and his group was defeated. So now you've got these three. Mark Antony was, what was his role? He was the consul, so he's the one who kind of initially is the leader. Lepidus I don't know as well. I think he was a general who had an army too. Octavian, you know better as Caesar Augustus. He's Julius Caesar's, is it like nephew? So a relative of Julius Caesar, although not like as direct as his son. And the three of them now have a power alliance. Julius Caesar was assassinated in 44, so this forms just after that and lasts for about the next 10 or 12 years. And like the first triumvirate, this one lasted as long as these three men had a common enemy to fight against. But as soon as they had gotten rid of the people who had gotten rid of Julius Caesar, then these three are going to turn against each other. So here's where some of these names are familiar. Who did Mark Antony, who is the woman by his side? Cleopatra, who is the queen of which empire? But you know him better from our last weeks as the Ptolemies. So when you hear Cleopatra, queen of Egypt, I don't know how much her blood was from the ancient Egyptian pharaohs as much as she's the one who is the remaining ruler of that the Greek Ptolemies that had been ruling in Egypt. So I think she'd been connected romantically with Julius Caesar. Isn't that how it was? And then after he died, so she's connected with Mark Antony. So of those three, the two that end up fighting each other in the end are Mark Antony versus Octavian. Who wins that out? Octavian does, but again, this is all playing into how the politics works. What year? I think it was year 43. Antipater, Father Herod the Great, someone poisons him and he dies. So now his sons are trying to continue the influence of the Idumeans on not just Jewish politics, but Rome in general. So Herod, the one who's going to be Herod the Great, he sails to Rome, and right now he's the ally of Mark Antony. So Mark Antony arranges for Herod to stand up in the Roman Senate, and he's declared the king of the Jews in the Roman Senate in like the year 40-something. Herod goes back home, but now, whoops, who wins Mark Antony versus Octavian? Octavian wins, so now Herod's on the wrong side. So he gets on his ship and sails to meet Octavian and says, I'm sorry, I picked the wrong guy, but now I'm going to support you. So this about 20, 40-year period, there's a lot of shifting in how power works in the Roman Empire. Caesar Augustus is the name taken by Octavian. So usually, the date I've seen for the start of the Roman Empire is 27 BC, which again you'll find people on both sides of that saying the Roman Empire was strong and served a lot of people for a long time. Other people would say the year 27 BC marks the end of any kind of representative process, and from then on out you have one man who has complete power. And Caesar Augustus, then, you can track how over his reign, he was able to complete what Julius Caesar and others before him had tried to do, where the Roman Senate really has no real power anymore. And as far as who is ruling everything, it is the Caesar. They still had a thing about they couldn't call him the king, even though he was, in fact, the kind of sole ruler that I think Romans, a couple generations before, would have said, that's something Romans are never going to have a king, but now you've got the Roman emperor. If you put a date at the end of the Roman Empire, 476 is who's the last king of Rome or emperor of Rome as the barbarians from Europe come in and conquer Rome. Rome fell a couple of times and got weaker and weaker as those final centuries went. By that time, the empire had split, and there was the western side with the capital at Rome. Eastern side, the capital was Constantinople or Byzantium. And that side continued until like the 1500s. So you could say the Roman Empire and that eastern side continued long after that. But that's getting beyond what we're talking about here. Again, if I pause there, anything you want to ask about, or things that just you remember, oh, this is something I remember about the Romans? Then going back to that map, by the time Augustus Caesar dies in AD 14, so this would be after the birth of Jesus, now we're adding in the green areas. And by now, which areas are being added on? Most important for us, Judea is now added on this map where it hadn't been in end of Julius Caesar's lifetime. Egypt is now added on this map. The rest of what we would call Turkey today, that'll be important because Paul is traveling through all these areas. And so by the time of the early Christian church, true like the Romans would push up into Britain, they built Hadrian's Wall at the part where they kind of stopped pushing north. They never got all the way up into Scotland. So there are some areas that would be added in red later. But by the time Augustus Caesar dies in AD 14, this is the map that we're working with now for the New Testament. This book I've been reading through, Time Between the Testaments, had a timeline on page 30, and that's what I copied out and gave you. This is now looking at the New Testament time period and the rulers. I don't know everybody's names on here, and so if you don't either, that is just fine. But I think the main point to see is there are three different levels of who's ruling if you look at Judea. So on the left side would be different events. There's a column just called the Herods, because Herod the Great's family even after they're not having total power in the area, they're still going to be part of the picture all the way through the New Testament. And the thing that's really confusing for me is they kept naming their kids Herod. And so when the Bible, you run into Herod in the Bible, there are 3 or 4 different Herods. And probably again next week, I need to look at what can fit in an hour next week, but I'll probably throw the family tree of Herod up. And you can see how that, so Herod the Great is the one where Jesus is in Bethlehem and he tries to kill the children there. When Jesus is on trial, he's in front of a different Herod, the one who put John the Baptist to death. Peter and the early apostles face another Herod, Herod Agrippa I. And then Paul is going to stand trial before Herod Agrippa II. So all of them are connected to Herod's family. And next week we'll look more at how his father Antipas and Herod were able to work connections with the Romans and to have power, even though they were not actually Jewish, they were Idumean. Next one is governors of Judea. What year did the Romans start actively governing Judea? First guy on that list is Coponius, the year 6. So I don't know if that surprises you or not, but this is after Jesus. So if Jesus was born in like 4 BC, this is when Jesus is like 10 years old. So before that, Judea would have been under Roman influence and like a client state. But this is why that map doesn't list Judea as part of the Roman Empire until just at the end of Augustus' life, because now the Romans are going to start to have governors in Judea. Most of them, I don't know their names, but who's on that list that you recognize? Pontius Pilate. So he is number 1, 2, 3, 4. He's 5th on the list. Josephus has stories from outside the New Testament about these men and what they were like. In general, they didn't understand or really care about Jewish culture. So as much as Herod wasn't always a great ruler either, at least he tried to understand Jewish culture. These Roman governors didn't always. The way that Josephus writes, Pontius Pilate committed some pretty major atrocities in his leadership there, killing a lot of people who didn't deserve it. After Pontius Pilate, Marcellus, Marulus, Cuspius Fadus, Tiberius, none of them show up in the Bible, but if you go down to the bottom, Felix and Festus are in the book of Acts because the Apostle Paul ends up being on trial in front of them. Albinus and Gessius Florus. Why does the list of governors of Judea end in the year 66? That's when the Jews revolt against the Romans and kick the governor out. And so now you've got a war of the Jews against the Romans that lasts until the year 70. And over on the left side of the page, what's the main event in 70 AD? Destruction of the temple. So Roman rule is going to continue after that, but that really is a watershed date as far as what it meant to be Jewish living in Judea, because the temple was destroyed. Many Jews were killed or sold into slavery. The money that was plundered was used to build the Colosseum in Rome. If you go to Rome and see the Arches of Triumph, you'll see them carrying the menorah out of the temple So that's where Jew and Roman, the relationship really deteriorated quickly, 66 to 70. Again, Pompeii is like 63 BC. So figure about 70 years of being under general Roman control, but not specifically Roman governors. And then about 70 years of having Roman governors. Before that war. The right column, then here are the emperors. Again, before 27 BC, there is no emperor. You still have the Roman Republic. You got Augustus, 27 to 40. It's under him that there's the first persecution of Christians. Rome had a huge fire, and Nero blamed that on Christians. So as far as we know, this is where Paul was put to death. So on the left side, you've got events in Paul's lifetime. His first and second journeys are probably, Claudius. Book of Acts talks about how Claudius told all the Jews they had to leave Rome for a while. I had a sermon on Revelation a couple weeks ago. Domitian was the emperor while John was in exile. If you love Roman history, this is where people have written a huge amount on the history of each of these eras and those men. And even if you go on Wikipedia, you could read some pretty long articles about the Roman Republic or the Empire, or about either of those triumvirates, or about the Hasmoneans and how they invited Pompey in. But for me, I guess those are some of the basic things about how does Roman history tie in with setting up the New Testament time period. Ginny.
Did the Herods only rule in Judea?
It depended on the time period. Let's save that one for next time, because I need to look at that more myself. Herod the Great, again, they're not part of the Roman Empire. He's the client king. And so Herod the Great had a lot of autonomy himself. But then once you get to 6 and you've got Roman governors, Herod's descendants had a lot less power. Other trouble is that Herod had a lot of family intrigue. Like, if you want a soap opera story, when you're murdering your own sons because they're disloyal to you. This book had a great quote. The word for hog and son sounds similar in Greek. And I think it was Caesar Augustus said about Herod, "I'd rather be his hog than his son." Because Herod observed Jews didn't eat hogs. So if you were Herod's hog, at least your life was probably safe. That was Caesar's view of what kind of man Herod was. But after Herod died, then his area was split up among his sons. So then you've got different sons of Herod ruling in different areas. So if you remember when Joseph and Mary come back from Egypt with Jesus, they pick to go back to Nazareth because they don't like which Herod is ruling in Judea at the time. It's part of their decision making. But yeah, we'll come back, and next time would be talking more about Herod and his family and about the different political parties. You've got the Pharisees, you've got the Sadducees, Zealots, Essenes. Anybody else? We got like 3 minutes left.
Why did Octavian change his name to Caesar Augustus? Was it like a title? Was it like a, association?
Wikipedia would know that better than me. Caesar is the family name. So Romans, you have 3 different names. It's Gaius Julius Caesar. And so he is taking on Julius Caesar's family name is Caesar. And Augustus, August means someone who's great. And so I think that he took that name in 27, which is when people consider the Roman Empire beginning. Finally, he was deified by the Romans too. He became a god officially. And, yeah. Let's end today with a prayer. Lord God, we see how nations come and go and things are always changing, and yet you're working out your eternal plan and purpose through it all. And so I pray today that you'd guide and keep us in our times too, that you'd be working your plan in our lives and in our world, and that for us that would end in heaven with you forever. So please go with us and bless each of us today.